This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Kari Grady Grossman is the co-founder of Sustainable Schools International. After traveling to Cambodia in 2001 to adopt their son, Kari and her husband created the school, and because of Kari, the school has the first primary school music program in Cambodia, a teacher's residence, and library. She also started a silk import business and an environmentally sustainable cooking fuel business to support schools. A former writer for Discovery Channel Online, Kari is also the author of Bones That Float, a story of adopting Cambodia, which was the winner of the 2008 Peacemaker of the Year Award from the Independent Publishers Association and a Gold Nautilus Book Award for world-changing books. I spoke with Kari in Fort Collins, Colorado. Hello, Kari. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you very much for having me.
Where do we find you today? Where in the world?
I am sitting at my desk in Fort Collins, Colorado.
As you and I have talked before the show, I have a personal connection to Fort Collins. I love it up there. I hope it's been a wonderful summer.
Yeah, it's always too short summer in the Rockies, where Colorado people are kind of nutso for the mountains and the outdoors, and we just try to get as much in as we can in the summer as possible, and kids are starting back to school today.
Fantastic. You are the founder and the executive director of an organization called Sustainable Schools International. Why don't we start out by you telling us, what does that organization do? What's its mission? What are you seeking to achieve?
Well, we work with schools in rural Cambodia. It's been an evolution into its mission, but it essentially started in 2001 when I adopted my oldest son from Cambodia. He was a baby, and we wanted to give back to the country in some way. And we got involved with another organization that was building schools, and we donated to the construction of a school kind of in his honor, but in a different part of the country, a poorer and more rural and part of the country than he was actually from. And so, supporting that one school for many years kind of is what led to the evolution of creating Sustainable Schools International, because after about 6 years, I realized the school was made more functional by having me and us, keeping an eye on things and donating, that it was, very much dependent on me doing that. And if I didn't come up with a systemic way of empowering the local community to do it on their own, as soon as I stopped, it would stop. And that wasn't, creating or building on a reliable way to get out of poverty and the misery that is rural Cambodia. So SSI didn't come about, although we incorporated as a nonprofit under a different name in 2003, SSI became an organization in 2008 under the name Sustainable Schools International, which was setting the intention to create a sustainable way of supporting that through the local community. And it's been a very large learning curve to answer that question. So we find ourselves today.
Yeah, sure. So is there a particular lever that you use to create sustainability? Is there something that you've learned along the way that works the best? Is there a process?
Oh, boy, that's a very loaded question with a very loaded answer. But I would say that, it boils down to creating both human and financial resources locally, which when you're working in a rural village in Cambodia means starting from the beginning, because, of course, when I started, nobody had finished fourth grade in this whole region. And I will say that here today in 2015, we have our first we've had one college graduate before them and three more graduating this year with bachelor's degrees who are from that village. So that's step one. But that's not where I started. I didn't start with step one. I started with my own idea of, what we needed to do was an ongoing source of income to provide the financial aid for all the various problems that needed to be solved. Number one among them being paying teachers a living wage and providing housing and bathrooms and things for teachers from other parts of the country to stay in a remote rural area that's difficult to live in. Think of it like you or I being educated in a college in Fort Collins and being sent to Appalachia to teach with a very low salary and no place to live. Mm-hmm. You probably wouldn't show up, and neither do they. So our support up until that point was really about supporting teachers because we didn't want that original school building to stand empty. Lots of other buildings were being built all around this area by various donors that came and were donating to the Cambodian government to build, construct government schools. But the government didn't have money or willingness to operate schools in these areas before the buildings were built. So what makes them think they're going to operate them after they're built?
Yeah, sure, of course.
So that was really, really what we were focusing on. So in the beginning, about 2008, when we really incorporated under the name SSI with this intention of creating local sustainability, we immediately started focusing on the financial resources, going to studying, learning about lots of other organizations were doing. One in particular called Read Global in Nepal really was kind of a guiding light in our thinking. And, we were looking at creating community-owned business that would meet a local need and create an income source. And that being cooking fuel, because this area we're working as being heavily deforested for cooking fuel. It was an interesting learning experience in that, the first attempt failed. Good first attempts do, because as I said a few minutes ago, I didn't start with step one, human resources. I started step two, which was financial resources. And really, what I learned from that experience, we worked on that project for about 2 years. And that this community I was working in, there was a lot of dysfunction, a lot of dishonesty, distrust, all of which are for Cambodia a big social capital issue that is the outcome of 30 years of war and conflict. And that without any educated people, and not just academically educated, but also education around leadership skills, we weren't going to be able to have any kind of community project, community sustainability, community institution, because there is nobody with the capacity to lead that in a good way that would bring community together and have people working together instead of sort of in a passive-aggressive survival mode that's no one's communicating openly and honestly and with trust. So that's what I learned from that experience. There's a long way to answer your question, I know, but it's important because we stopped that project, learned, did not chastise ourselves for quote unquote wasting money. But what we realized was what the villagers really needed were local leaders, and that those local leaders had to learn not only academic skills, but leadership skills and really come into the modern world with communication and all of that. So we started a high school scholarship program. It happened to be by that time that we had enough kids who had actually finished primary school, and we were now supporting a secondary school, which would take them up to 9th grade if they stayed in school that long, which is difficult for a number of reasons. But we did, by about 2010, have young people finishing 9th grade, and were able to offer scholarships, and started a residential program in Phnom Penh called the Leadership Academy. And we now have 38 boys and girls in that program who are all studying to various degrees and various things, all aimed at giving back to their community in a way that's going to improve a problem that they see as a big problem in their village that they want to fix.
Wow. I don't even know where to start. This is fantastic stuff. You started this years ago, 2008. You decided to incorporate. What was sort of the leap off point? I mean, obviously you adopted your first son there, and so you had this attachment to Cambodia, and that was why you decided to invest. But at what point did you say, "All right, this is what we want to do, and we know that we're ready to make the financial, the emotional, the professional commitment to doing this"? Like, what was that moment?
Oh gosh, there's been many moments. So many moments. Well, I suppose the moment would be, kind of 2 years after that original building was built, I went back to visit because I was researching to write a book about Cambodia. I came to this profession as a journalist, not.
Which is something I wanted to talk about because, you have an unusual profile from most of the people who we interview on this show, that not unusual in the sense that you've come to it from another profession, because that's actually many, many people. But you are so clearly a writer. I mean, you've written a book. You're a journalist. That's really your passion, and you found your way to SSI through that. And I don't mean to interrupt. So why don't you tell us that story as well?
Okay. Well, I had been working as a journalist for the Discovery Channel Online at the time. And so at the time, this was pre blogs. I was being sent a lot of places to do kind of live storytelling from the field. Anyway, so I was kind of used to that. And when I went back to Cambodia after adopting my son, I was kind of using that experience and looking at creating a book about Cambodia because at the time, 2001, 2003, there wasn't very many books about Cambodia that were not focused on just history and the war and stuff, nothing that really focused on the time after the Khmer Rouge and kind of what happened, which of course all ties back to my son's own story. So anyway, the point is, being a journalist, I asked a lot of questions. That's, I think, what my strength was. And on those research couple of trips, I went and visited the school that we had donated, and I asked a lot of questions, and the answers to the questions bothered me. And they bothered me enough that I stopped my job as a journalist and decided to focus on this. But the question that bothered me the most was when I went to visit the school and I met with a group of parents and I asked them why kids didn't go to school. They told me that's because the teachers don't show up. Teachers are absent often. And I didn't at first really understand why, but what I learned was, the teachers are government teachers, trained in the provincial towns that are far away from this rural area. And they were sent there and they had no housing and they didn't have enough pay and they didn't have enough water. And, it was a miserable condition to try and work in. And when I visited that school, some of them actually had a hammock and a little cooking stuff kind of in the corner, and they actually slept on the cement floor and lived on the cement floor of the school. And I began my journey essentially by, figuring out how to support teachers so that they could actually do their job. And all of my background as a journalist kind of always came into play because I would just continue to ask questions and try to understand the story, why things were so dysfunctional. And it's kind of like peeling away layers of an onion. You're just kind of peeling back and learning more the whole time. And every decision that was made to create what is now SSI's sort of programmatic system was all a result of those inquiries.
How do you do this from Fort Collins? Are there people sitting in Cambodia full time working for SSI? And
Yeah.
so what's the structure of the organization look like?
Yeah, it's another thing that has evolved over time. But essentially, we have a staff of 5 in Cambodia now. We're at an interesting point now that we're able to start employing some of our graduating students. So we're really developing the Cambodian staff from within because we've really created a culture of leadership and entrepreneurship and cooperation that is, hard to hire into in a place like Cambodia. So it's a slow process to build your human resource base, and we look at our leadership program as a human resource development incubator for us, as well as the village and whatever they go on to do in life later. So we have our sort of country director in training is our first college graduate. His name is Kong. So Kong was our first college graduate about 3 years ago, and he was working we had a very fortuitous, positive influence in having a Cambodian man who was a refugee in the 70s, lived here in the United States for 25 years, raised his family there, and went back to Cambodia looking for a way to serve. And he and I met, and he was our country director for 5 years. And so Kong was really mentored by him as he came up through our program and graduated. And, the organization has grown a lot. So we have a couple of village staff that are like community liaisons or school liaisons. And then we have a leader of our leadership program manager. But all these people are kind of the bridge between us is right now an international advisor, and we're on 6-month cycles with that. And so we've had different international advisors come and serve by really mentoring our staff and our students as well on the communication between us. We do a lot of our communication by Skype. Our organization has grown enough that I am almost a full-time fundraiser, a development person most of the time, and I've actually now hired an operations manager here who goes over 2 or 3 times a year and does this weekly Skype calls with the staff, with the international advisor. They are kind of helping everyone on the staff understand the outcomes and the action items of the conversations, which works really well to develop their ability to do those things on their own. And she, the operations manager, actually does have a master's degree in international development, more in the natural resources management area than education. But operationally, you do get to the point where you need to have people with those, skills and background and experience come in to start, managing your operations. When you're small and you're kind of the visionary person, you can kind of manage it to a point. But it definitely outgrew my skills as a journalist, as a person who was able to kind of connect all the dots and create the vision and inspire people forward. But eventually, you have to have someone who can nail the details into place. And I've been fortunate to be able to build that on this side. She lives and works in Fort Collins and travels a couple times a year. I travel a couple times a year. And then we have this full-time international advisor that I think of as a bridge between us as we're developing our staff, again, mostly coming up through our organization as students graduate.
What's the next 5 years look like for you? I love the arc that you've got going right now. You literally an idea and a frustration, turned into an organization, turned into, figuring out along the way. Now you've got sort of a process that you have and you've grown into staff. Is your goal over the next 5 years to try to serve more schools and expand the operation? Is it to do what you do now better, in a locality? Or what's that vision for you right now? Do you want to step away? Do you want to exit the organization?
For me personally, I don't want to exit the organization. I want to continue to guide it and be its visionary and be its founder. But I'm hoping to step out of the management role. I'm right now the executive director. As I mentioned, our director of operations is doing a great job in managing program. But I need, someone to really focus on managing the ongoing fundraising aspects as well as the business development aspects, because we now have enough graduates to start developing more entrepreneurial endeavors to get back to those financial resources I talked about at the beginning. And some of those are up and running and some of them are kind of startups. So we need some management in that area, but all of it requires, someone to be in your executive leadership position who wants to manage people. And as you pointed out a few minutes ago, I'm a writer. I'm a visionary, and I think all organizations that start with sort of a strong personality founding person goes through a point where it's time for that person to get out of the way and let other people who can build on that idea and that vision in a better way, and to have the humility to recognize that. And I think that's the point I'm at, to answer your question. So we're building our board capacity right now, and we're mapping out a plan for bringing in some other management staff here and move me onto the board in kind of a board chairman role or a board founder role. So I think for the next 5 years, I will definitely be a guiding force of leadership on the board. I'm not sure when. Hopefully with the next coming year, we will have the capacity and find the right person to be in either a development director position or a executive director position. My program manager doesn't want it. She wants to stay focused on the program, and that's totally appropriate. But you get to the point where you have to be able to raise bigger money easier.
Yes.
And we're at that point, and I'm, just like everybody who's in this profession, faces burnout at some point. And for me, being the visionary, which is always solving the problems. Anybody who's an entrepreneur will tell you what's an entrepreneur. It's a person who solves problems all day long, every day. Mm-hmm. And doing that plus, management plus constant fundraising, can burn too much of your energy. And I see that sort of handwriting on the wall. So I'm trying to set up SSI's staff capacity to be able to parcel out. I've been doing a lot myself for many years. It's a good problem to have, right? We're successful. We have students graduating. We're building. We've expanded now to seven government schools in this region because the schools we were working in were so full to capacity because people were sending their kids from afar because the teachers showed up and they wanted to build more buildings. I said, no, we already have buildings. We just need to bring our program to those buildings. And that's how we've sort of started to scale, if you will. That's a big buzzword, scale. And we could go into that for a while. I will table it for now and what scale means. But essentially, we've defined our program area as this one region called Oral that has 7 schools in it. And it is, the focus is creating those human and financial resources to not only the schools to operate, but many other sectors to have the students coming back and doing projects. The Leadership Academy is how we're generating that. And so what I see as we grow 5 years down the road is that Leadership Academy will expand and take in more, promising rural students from very under-resourced areas and bring them to the city and give them the opportunity for, a safe place to live and food to eat and get, have their academic work at the public universities and schools and stuff, but then supplementing that with all of our programs in leadership and in entrepreneurship and a mentorship program. We've started to help them create a project, a community service project back in their village. So I don't want to expand all these schools all over the rural area, but this one area serves as kind of a learning site, an incubator, a lab, if you will, for other students from other parts of the country who are learning it through the Leadership Academy program.
I want to capture this while you're talking about it too, because you've spoken a lot about entrepreneurialism. You talk leadership, solving problems, figuring out as you go. This is also another part of your life as well. I mean, I'm lucky enough to know that you own a tea house in Fort Collins. You're a journalist. You've been sort of an individual professional for essentially your entire professional career. How have you balanced that? I think this is a problem or a common situation for many people in the service industry, right? The people who are in the humanitarian aid, international development world, they balance their life with other outlets like that. And how have you done that? How have you been able to sort of walk that fence?
Well, I haven't always walked it well. I've fallen off here and there.
Well, we all have. Come on. I mean, if you didn't fall off a couple of times, we would all you would have written another book and you'd probably wouldn't have any fundraising problems.
Yeah. So anyway, there's a couple of things. You mentioned our tea house. So my husband and I also own a tea house. We are kind of serial entrepreneurs for the last 20 years since we were in our early 20s. We never worked for other people. We always started businesses and sold them. And of course, you learn a lot in that process. It's probably equivalent to going and getting a master's or a PhD, but it's more of the school of hard knocks than the school of book learning. Both have their value. So anyway, having a retail business like our tea house, which is called Happy Lucky's Tea House, selling retail tea here in Fort Collins. It's a small Main Street business with a small staff, but it's probably been our most successful endeavor in terms of it is now expanding and opening more stores. And, that's interesting in that it balances me professionally, in that it teaches me a lot about what I have to do in Cambodia as we're starting to build small businesses with our students there. And then that you come up against having to play by the rules of a different playbook in a different country. And that can be very, very frustrating, and that can burn you out, as well as the fundraising I mentioned earlier. So what do I do to balance that? I think this is really important. I think it's really important that anybody who pursues this kind of profession goes in with their eyes wide open, that it can be really, really draining, the number of problems, the number of pressures, and playing by different sets of rule books in different countries. So anyway, for me, the answer for the balance question is nature. I spend a lot of time in nature. I live in Colorado. I come back. I do not live in Cambodia. If I lived in Cambodia full time, I think I would go crazy from, dealing. Although I love being there, I love the culture. I love how productive me and our staff can be when I'm spending my time there. But I was there all the time and couldn't get away from it, I would get burned out really fast. I wouldn't have the perseverance. So when I'm in Colorado, I can kind of break away from that, and I can do my hiking in the mountains. I love to run rivers. I paddleboard. I'm an avid skier, and I bring my children and my husband out with me, and we spend our family time outdoors and in nature, and that's the great balancer for me. Without that to fill my well, I wouldn't have the energy to help be a source of leadership for solving all these endless problems that all of our staff and students are addressing on a daily basis.
So I have just two more questions for you. The first one is, what's your go-to story? You own a tea house. Maybe you get to sit down with some friends or new acquaintances quite often. And, what's that story that you tell them about SSI, either about a teacher that you trained or one of your graduates or some unusual thing about Cambodia that you don't think anybody else knows about?
Stephen, there's 4 questions in that question.
But what's your go-to one? You sit down and you're like, let me tell you about the time I was stuck in the.
There's like 100 of those too, maybe 200. Anyway, but the one I'm going to tell you is there are many. But of course, there's nothing like, despite all the frustration and personal sacrifice that I've made, and you do in this profession, you make a lot of personal sacrifice to do the work. What makes it all worth it is, of course, seeing the outcome, seeing the success. So that's a story I'm going to tell you, which is incidentally about Kong. And Kong, as I said, was our first college graduate. He did not come up through the program because he was a little bit older when we started, when nobody had finished 4th grade. But by the time I met him was right when we started our leadership program, and he had already graduated high school. And he was the only person from this village, from this whole 7-village area, that had gone on to secondary education. The only person. He had walked 17 kilometers a day to do it. He was very driven. He is the son of the village carpenter, and his mom, had no education at all. They were rice farmers. And so he came into our program and went and got a 2-year associate's degree in English and computers. He is a natural-born entrepreneur and problem solver. And then he mentored under Paul Chuck, our Cambodian returnee that was just recently retired this year. And Kong is kind of stepping into his shoes. And he mentored with him for 3 years. And all of our students are required, as part of their scholarship, to go back to their community and do a community service project as volunteers while they're still in school. And then once they graduate, as either paid or on an internship or starting an enterprise or whatever the case may be. In Kong's case, he started a microloan program in his village as a way to not only, at the time there wasn't much access to capital through a microloan system. And, it was a very entrepreneurial endeavor to start a bank with $500 and learning how to do it along the way from all the various NGOs and other organizations that do micro lending. And he is now the guy who is the go-to guy for credit in that town. And he's grown the bank to $25,000 in loan capital. He's gotten 130 customers. 98 of them either started or supporting the expansion of small village-based business. And he's generating income about $7,000 a year, which we're using to fund teacher salaries.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is super cool. I can see why he's the go-to guy to run SSI as well.
He is, but what's hard about that is, as you're grooming him to kind of be the country director, and he's great and wants to learn all these new skills, but that requires him being in the city and networking with people and doing sort of office-y tasks. And he's a village kid. And when I was just in Cambodia a month ago with him in the village and seeing him function in the village, that's where he shines. He just is such a bright light and such a leader, and he's honest and he's low key and he doesn't have a big power trip going on. And the people that he loans money to are just so happy to work with him, and they're so proud of what they're accomplishing together. They're very happy to tell you their story of the first time Kong loaned them money and what they did with it and how they built on that. And now they have this expanded business, and it's the kind of leadership that these rural areas need. And it's the kind of leadership we're trying to duplicate through the rest of our students. And And we are duplicating it. We now have a graduate in agriculture who's being mentored in an agriculture project. We have our first nursing student graduating who's right now being mentored by a CSU graduate student in public health to create a public health project. So seeing them go back there and be these young leaders in the village with the new kind of attitude of what leadership is all about is very, very fulfilling.
Wow. That's just those 3 stories alone, just fantastic stuff. The last question is the same as the question I ask every guest here on the Terms of Reference podcast. And you alluded to it earlier. You gave us one insight, but there are many, many individuals like yourself who either come from a different profession or, are interested in starting their own NGO in some way or helping out in a community that they visited, and they want to create a career out of it. You've stumbled into this career like so many of us. What are your 1 or 2 pieces of advice for somebody who either has a master's degree or is interested in transitioning into this work about how to do it successfully? What you said, keep your eyes open and make sure that you refill the well, but is there any other skill sets or any other critical pieces of advice that you'd put on the table?
Well, that would be different for each individual who comes to this from a different path. But I suppose if we're talking about people who come to this choice in life through the academic path, if you will, is, boy, I cannot state enough how important it is to have field experience. There's nothing more frustrating. The villagers are your teachers. They're your teachers. No matter what your professor said, the villagers are your teachers. And learning to, as a journalist, I already knew how to ask questions and listen to answers and ask more questions. But what nothing is more frustrating than being in, and this happens a lot when you're in the funding world, because a lot of funding sources have, big conferences. The funders all talk to each other about what's best practice and in certain things. And I feel like I want to stand up in these conferences and say, hey, everybody, you don't talk to each other. You don't need to sit in conferences anymore. You need to sit in villages and you need to talk to the people you're trying to help. And you need to learn that what their world is like and stand in their shoes and see these blockades that are in front of them. And yes, you have the worldview and the experience and the education to be able to see more than the obstacle. But sometimes if we don't look at it from their point of view, we can't see the obstacle. Like, it's obvious to us how this should be solved, but you know what? If you're standing in their shoes and you look at the obstacle and all you see is the obstacle and you can't see around it, then, our solutions that we offer are kind of in that slow expansion of the world beyond the obstacle. And how are we going to, work on this together to overcome this obstacle? And then just be willing to learn from your mistakes. Your mistakes are your other best teachers.
A fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your story about Sustainable Schools International and how you've grown this organization.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from 8preneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.